show people what's going on, give people understanding of then how the brain works, how people understand issues, and then provide some concrete solutions for how they can change the communication.
You're listening to the No Labels, No Limits podcast with best-selling author Sarah Box. We focus on the mantra, no labels, no limits, no excuses. And now without further ado, please welcome your commanding coach with plenty of chutzpah and heart, Sarah Box.
Hey there, No Labels, No Limits podcast listeners. Welcome back. I'm Sarah Box, your host of the No Labels, No Limits podcast. And this is all about being on a mission to help individuals, teams, and organizations think outside the box, move beyond limiting beliefs, and create a profound impact in the lives of others and the world around them that they desire. And today I am thrilled to introduce Brett Davidson, the innovative founder and principal of Wingseed, an organization dedicated to harnessing the transformative power of narrative, storytelling, and listening for social justice. So it's a triad right there of power. Brett's background is as fascinating as his work. He grew up in South Africa and became a pivotal voice in radio journalism during the country's transition to democracy. And for those of us here in the state, we may not remember that time, but Brett does. And it was pivotal, and voice carries. So a surprising fact about Brett is that he didn't have access to television until he was 10 years old, which helped cultivate this profound love and appreciation for radio that shaped his career. And now he resides in the Catskills, New York, no longer in South Africa. Brett and I are in a mastermind group together, and one thing that he consistently does is he brings that really thoughtful insight to what he's hearing and how it might be interpreted and understood in a different way. And that, to me, really shows his unique blend of media and profound commitment to social change, as well as his ability to hear beyond what the surface conversation is. So now, with that as an introduction, let's officially welcome Brett Davidson to the podcast. Hi, Brett.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. And let me ask you, when you started out, so wait, let me just back up a second. I had TV in the house before I was 10, but it was very limited. It was black and white. Maybe you had to touch the TV to get a good signal coming in. It was funky, nothing like today. So when you first had TV in your house, what do you remember about that? What were you guys watching, and what was in your kids' world?
We didn't actually get television immediately in my family, but my grandmother had a black and white television. And so every Monday we used to go to her house, to her apartment, which is a little way away, and watch Chips, the American show about California highway patrolmen. So that was the thing I remember, going every Monday to watch Chips with my grandmother and watching hot dogs while sitting on the lounge floor.
That's because today that's not our experience with TV. It's not that kind of pivotal thing. And I do remember those. It's like nights, Sunday nights, bonanza night for the family.
Right. Yes.
And it was a big whoop if we could have a TV dinner. It tells you we weren't really very well off, right? TV dinner is big special night. But I just thought about that, and how voice and audio has connected us over time. But starting out as, in groups of families around one person's device, whether it was a radio in the early 30s, 40s, whatever, or TVs as it came along. So how did that influence your entree into radio? Did it influence how you got into media?
Well, as I said, we got television in South Africa when I was 10. So before that, we had radio, and radio was all sorts of things. You had radio dramas, you had, game shows, you had, there was a kiddies program every afternoon just for children, so it wasn't just music or news or talk. It was all these different things. And I think the one thing I remember is about, we had our radio serials, right? Like soap operas and things. So we would go to school and talk, with the other school kids about what happened on the show last night. And just like you did with TV later on. But the thing about radio is that it's all in your head, right? So they use sound effects, it's voice and sound effects and music. And so you create this scenario in your head and you have this whole rich imagination of what the world looked like. Whereas with TV, it's just given to you. It's someone else's imagination. It's someone else's vision. With radio, yes, it's someone else's script and all of that, but it's actually your vision in your head. You create how the characters look. You have an idea about how the presenters look. You have an idea of how that world looks. And I think that was really rich. And I think that was something that was kind of lost after the introduction of television.
Well, for me, radio, like when I mean, we had TV and stuff, but radio is a constant, for me, because you could put it in your pocket, you could go. You couldn't put your TV in your pocket at that point. We weren't where we are today. But you could always have it. And I remember when I first left home and I was like out on my own and a little nervous being on my own because I was used to having a lot of people around. But I remember I would go to sleep by putting a ball game on and just listening to the ball game. And I had my favorite teams, but mostly I had my favorite broadcasters because they created pictures in my head for me.
Yeah.
So that ability to create imagination. And even today, listening to old radio shows, I marvel, right? Because some of those actors went on to be film or TV actors, but just how much with so little in terms of props and stuff, how big things could feel in your head, right? Like it might just be this tiny little room they're broadcasting in, but you've got this whole mansion they're going through and all of that. So how did you transition from a journalist and radio anchor in South Africa to financing Wingseed, and going into founding Wingseed, but really having that big shift, because that's a big shift.
Yeah, it sounds like a big thing, but it was many long journey and many steps in between. So I worked in Johannesburg in television and co-anchored a show that was kind of like South Africa's All Things Considered for a couple of years. And then worked on a different show for a couple of years and then decided I just wanted something different. As interesting as it was very much, it had to be in the studio every day, right? It was daily news. And I wanted to, firstly, instead of reporting on the news and kind of being on the outside looking in, I wanted to actually be involved in something myself, and actually helping change things myself. And the other thing was, it just becomes exhausting to kind of every day do this thing. So it's kind of like this, hamster wheel that every day, the news cycle. And so dive into things in a bit more depth. And then I just wanted to experience a different place to live because I lived in Johannesburg my whole life. So I found a job in Cape Town, which is on the coast, and moved there and got a job in a nonprofit called IDASA, which was working on democracy. So, we're looking at the political system, having advocacy around various laws and so on and so forth. And I worked with community radio. So I still was working with radio, but now more behind the scenes and working with community radio stations, which are community owned and run stations all around the country, and doing work supporting them to report on local government and local issues. And so I started getting involved in that work. So it was still kind of in radio, but now moving into the nonprofit world and advocacy. And I worked there for a number of years and then went on my own with a consultancy also called Wingseed in South Africa. Somehow got connected with someone from Open Society Foundations in New York, who then hired me as a consultant in the region and eventually was offered a job in New York. I moved to New York with my husband and worked at Open Society Foundations for about 11 years and then started my business Wingseed again, which I called it Wingseed again. So that's the kind of journey.
Such an overnight change.
Right. Yeah. So,
but when you started going into the public side, like I liked your comparison with All Things Considered because that's it's just a broad conversational or a broad span, right? So when you started going into that area, how did that feel different to you from news? Like not only just like the nuts and bolts of it, but how did it feel to you personally?
Well, I think I was never really involved in just the kind of straight news. It was news. It was news and current affairs, I would say. So, we would cover the issues of the day and interview the politicians but also do things like, music and culture. And so it was, as you said, like a wide range of things, but it was the kind of English language afternoon show that happened every day. So that was great. But I think the one thing that I should point out is that it, as you said, it was after the transition or during the transition to democracy. So it was also part of the transformation whereas the South African Broadcasting Corporation had very much been a mouth of the government before. And now we're trying to transform it into a public broadcaster, right? Which was not kind of just going to repeat the message of the ruling government of the day, but trying to actually be a national broadcaster, something on the lines of the BBC. We also then also incorporated, they were also trying to incorporate many, many different voices, whereas before only certain people's voices, white people's voices, with a very British sounding accent were allowed on air. And now it was open to people, if anyone in the country who spoke English could, if they were in that way inclined, might be hired and present on the radio. So you suddenly had this flourishing of different kinds of accents, different perspectives, different ways of seeing the world, which was also a part of creating that discussion in South Africa and opening the airways up to everyone and being more democratic.
How was that accepted? Like when you first started out, did everybody glom on right away and go, this is the best idea ever? Or did it take a while for people to go, I don't even understand what we're trying to do here, that's different?
Yeah, so there was obviously a lot of excitement from people who felt, they could hear people who sounded like them on the radio. But then many of the old listeners were very upset, and we got a lot of hate mail about that, that we're changing things. This was an old station they used to love, and so on. So there was definitely a period where there were many, many people unhappy, with what, I think that happens because wasn't just the radio, right? The whole country was changing. Yeah. So I think it wasn't just a reflection of what we were doing. I think people were unhappy with everything that was happening and changing. But yeah, slowly the stations. So initially, some listeners were shed. We lost listeners, but then other people started tuning in. And today that the station is still going. And it's has a whole different kind of audience now from what it had before.
From when you were there before, when it was just part of the old kind of thing.
Both. I think it's continued to transform. So it was a transition stage, and now it's very different again. But really, I think has a listenership now that's very representative of the demography of the country.
So how do you take, or how have you taken the lessons from that? Because that seems like a microcosm of what you've gone on to do on a bigger scope, right? That change and the resistance to change and persevering and continuing on for more voices. How have you taken that and put it into your social justice work?
I think one of the things was really, this idea, I think, of including different voices. How can we find people to speak with multiple perspectives? I think that's really stayed with me, and I think it was very conscious. We had to really work hard. So how do we if we wanted someone to speak about the stock market or about the economy or about whatever it was, astronomy, how do we find a black person? How do we find a person of color? How do we find a woman who's an expert? Whereas all, previously had been mainly white men. So consciously had to build our contact list and do the work to make it more diverse. It just didn't happen. So that was that. And I think the other thing is just about storytelling. I used to interview people, especially from nonprofits who you work with, and they used so much jargon that I never quite understood what they were talking about. They'd speak in all this abstract language about empowering people and undergoing capacity building and things and I would constantly try and understand what did they really mean and ask for examples. But people who could tell a concrete story, you wanted to listen to them more. You understood what they were talking about. And so those are the people I love to have and an interview, because I knew that people, listeners would really continue listening to them. And so that really was then it took me when I started to work in the nonprofit world and work with organizations, helping them think about how to communicate, was really realizing the power of story to, get people to listen and keep listening. Yeah.
So let's focus on nonprofit or foundational work, or the non-GMO NGOs. I was just thinking about food, no GMOs. Anyway, how do you help folks in that arena really utilize and hone their storytelling skills and their narrative power to advance their social justice work?
I think the first thing is, but now, I think a lot of people understand the power of storytelling, but many, a number of years ago, say 10, 15 years ago, I think it was much less the case. And I think that people had the idea, and some people still do, that if you just told people the facts, tell them what's really going on, they will realize and need to change. And of course, we realized that wasn't working. You can't just give people, cold facts and expect them. Yes, they might be aware, but awareness doesn't necessarily translate into any any kind of change or understanding. And so I think the first step is actually helping people understand that the message is not going through, that people are not getting you and not understanding you. And so, finding ways to speak to the audience and hear what they're getting and what they're understanding is really crucial. I often think about it as like riding the subway system in New York City. So you'll hear some muffled thing coming over the loudspeaker, and that the driver of the train thinks that they're talking and everyone's getting the message, but we're not, because the loudspeaker is not working and we're just hearing this kind of mumble. And I think often that's the case, right? That we think we're saying the things and we're convinced because we've got in a room with people who think like us and convinced this is the right message, that people are getting the message, but of course they're not, or they're not necessarily. And so you actually have to go and sit with the audiences and understand them and ask them questions, and then figure out how do you actually, ensure that the message is received, or that people are engaging in the kind of understanding and moving from awareness to action.
So when you talk about sitting with the audience and making sure the story is understood, the communication's understood, are you talking about that metaphorically or in the sense of like a focus group or a particular outreach strategy where you can actually ask questions of folks? What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, I think you have to actually go and ask questions. To some extent, you can imagine, but it doesn't have to be a very expensive research that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. But yes, a focus group would be super helpful. One of the most effective things I've ever seen was a colleague organized a focus group, in a place where they do these kind of focus groups. So you had people talking in the room and the NGO folks sitting behind the one-way mirror and listening, and they were shocked and horrified about, the difference between the language they used and what they thought people were getting, and then how people really think and understand things. And that in that case, that was a real turning point. And they were asking questions about, so how do we, what do we do? How do we change? How do we get through to people? Actually, I think, go back to my community radio days where we used to plan, with teams in local communities and actually walk through the community and ask people in the community, so what are the issues in this community? Show us. Who's the leader in this community who knows what's going on? Can we speak to them? What is their name? And really that transformed the way the stations were understanding their communities and understanding the issues, rather than waiting for a fax or a news brief from some organization to tell them. And many people say, well, I live in the community, I understand the community. You understand part of the community. You understand the part of the community you're involved in. You don't understand everything. So we used to have people draw maps, and then they would say, well, okay, where is more detail in the map? Where in the map in this community can you see there's more detail because you know about that? And where are there gaps? Where do you not know? What could you not draw because you don't know enough about it? Let's go there and walk the streets and find out. And so it does take some reaching out and kind of asking people, because I think otherwise you can't, we live in such a bubble, and it's worse these days because of algorithms and so on. So, we tend to speak to people who come from our same backgrounds, who have worked with us for many years. And so we start speaking the same language and forget that, that's not how everyone speaks or not what everyone understands.
How do you help people break that? I mean, I was laughing when we were talking about the whole nonprofit thing. And it's funny because it's true. It's like you start using acronyms, you start talking about things that if other people haven't been in that world, they're wondering, what are you talking about? And do I even care? The bigger question is, do I even care about what you're talking about? So how do you help us stop doing that and replace it or do something different that connects differently or more concretely, like you were talking about, with the audience we're trying to speak to?
So I think, as I said, it's trying to create understanding about how people think and how people understand. And so I think it's helpful to, again, tell stories, to people in the nonprofit world or the NGO world, and talk about how, and demonstrate what's happening. So one of the most effective things I've seen, who is a messaging expert by the name of Anat Shenker-Osorio, shows some optical illusions, right? And she talks about how you can't, then shows the solution, right? And goes back and says, you still see the thing that it's not there. You're still seeing it, right? And that's, you can't undo the way the human mind works. So then how do you actually help people understand what the real situation is? You have to work with the brain and how it works, work with the mind and how it works. And then, give people techniques and sort of ways to do that. So help people, again, help show people what's going on, give people understanding of then how, how the brain works, how people understand issues, and then provide some concrete solutions for how they can change the communication. And storytelling, is fundamental. There's a lot of research shown. One of the videos I've shown is an experiment done very early in the 20th century called the high decimal experiment, where they show a little screen with dots and abstract kind of geometric shapes moving around a screen. And you show that to people, and everyone creates a story out of it. You say, what did you see? Well, I didn't see, no one says I saw some random dots and like lines moving around the screen. They say there was a big dot and a little dot, and the big dot was chasing the little dot and trying to get away. You create a story. And so you see immediately that just inherently as humans, we need stories. It's the way we think. It's the way we communicate. And so through things like that, you can help people see that storytelling is essential. And it's not, it's not a panacea. Like anything else, you have to find ways to do it. There's many complexities. It has its own dangers, but it's a fundamental way in how we think. And so if we're not adding that or having that a big part of our communication, we're really missing something.
So here's a little mini challenge for you, Brett, if you're up for it in the moment. We're coming up on Giving Tuesday. By the time this airs, it won't be that far away. It's not that far out. Probably 6 weeks by the time this airs out. But it's an opportunity prior to that, during that time, and even after that, towards year end, for nonprofits and NGOs to tell an impactful story in a short amount of time, basically, that lets people understand the power and impact of their mission, whatever it is. What would you say are 3 components that you would recommend people don't overlook when they tell the story? Like you talked about data and information. Does that stay in? Does it not stay in? How would you, like, someone's got 60 seconds to tell or show a story of impact to get people to go, I want to get on this bandwagon. What tips do you have for that?
I think one is, tell a human story. So find a person, a human, someone's story you can tell, and then connect it to the data and the facts, right? So you can always tell the story of Sarah, who lives in this place. So this is what happened to Sarah. And Sarah's just, an example of, and then you can move into, bring in some of the data and facts. So it's not like you shouldn't have them, but help people connect to a human being, help people connect to a human story. I think that's the one. Think about ways to talk about your facts in ways that make sense. So don't give big numbers, break them down. You can say things like, that's enough to fill a swimming pool or whatever. If you have numbers, break them down in ways that people can understand. And there's lots of literature out there about these kinds of things. And another thing is connect to the values of your audience. I think that's really important. Show how does your audience member connect to this issue? Why should they care? What's in it for them in a sense, right? So find a way to understand what your audience member cares about, and then why the work you do will help, connects to that, and helps and sort of is aligned with their values. And so, I think that's the other thing. And I think we're often very used to talking about what's wrong, what we don't want and what we don't like. But talk about the vision of what's right, what's possible if they support you. Everyone, there's so much going wrong in the world today. We don't want another story about how terrible things are. Yes, you can talk about the problems, but then talk about how what you're doing is a solution, and what is that end vision. Help people imagine what the world could be like if they support you.
So that whole thing about solution or what's possible is so powerful. And I was doing a workshop today, and we're wrapping it up, but part of it was it was about conflict and communication, but part of it was about solving a problem. And so I'm asking people what they learned and what they took away from it. And I'm focusing in on what they understood about how they showed up and reacted and stuff. But this one gal says, well, what I really loved was they already had a solution before it hit me. And I thought, we want to know there's a way out, right? It's not just some other burden. So I love when you say that. It's like, give me like that I can help, but don't tell me how just bad things are, because it can become overwhelming after a while. And I think people tune out if it doesn't make sense to them.
And I think people also, and I certainly do, want more than just being asked to give money. There are so many appeals about, oh, the world's bad. This is help us. We need money. And yes, that's really important. But the money is important, but are there ways for people to connect beyond the money? Are there options? If, some people just want to, put a check or whatever, or send some money, and click a button and it's done. But some people want some way to get more involved. And so what are some other ways people can connect with the issue, if it's really important to them, and offer those options? I think that's really important as well.
You do a lot of social justice work, so you must see those options put into play where money's not available to people to give, but they want to be more actively involved. So can you offer some concrete solutions that other organizations have put out there? Like, if you're not doing money, here's another way, or just some simple things, because I think we overcomplicate things sometimes when there might be some simple asks that can help bring people in.
It might be come to a meeting. It might be help us spread the message. It might be talk to someone else about this issue. So there's so many, I think, many things you can think about that could be interesting and helpful for people to do. I'm kind of, in the world, social justice. So it's really also getting people involved in changing systems, right? So I think moving beyond an individualistic solution to, how can we change, how can we move beyond putting a band-aid on this problem? I think would be useful. What can people do towards actually fixing the kind of underlying cause of the problem? And it might be, calling your congressperson, whatever it is, to help them change something. It might be going to a protest or signing a letter. So, it's actually getting involved in, in helping change these bigger systems. I think that can be really powerful.
Do you find that people typically are willing to do that, or they just as soon write a check?
I think I think it really depends on how much people care about something, and so yes, like with me as well, there's many things I just want to send a check and that's it. But there's some things that I care a bit more about, and is there a way for me, to do something more? I think that's, and I think, the thing that we all hear about, in the media and so on, is this crisis of loneliness and disconnection. Is there some way of offering community and connection that is meaningful for people? And I think that could be really powerful.
I agree. I was speaking with a psychologist the other day, and she was talking about, first of all, we were talking about how it changed her business and her business model and stuff. But she also said that there's a part of her that feels we are still on the rebound from having spent time separated from one another, that we're still reintegrating our social skills with one another, and that we long for it. But for many people, they're just a little hesitant on some fronts to get out there. And so this, just even the connection piece could be, that's a gift in and of itself, to find community. Yeah. Now, the one thing I know that I have appreciated about you, Brett, in our group is that you really do emphasize listening. In fact, you gave a really great workshop on listening. So why does that matter to you, and how, because you teach on it and the impact of it. So will you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So, when I started working at Open Society Foundations, I worked with a great company called Narrative, and we went around the world doing storytelling training workshops. And they really emphasized listening, and they talked about listening as being the other side of the coin of telling, right? And one of the folks there, Murray Nossel, talked about listening being a bowl that shapes the telling, and so it's just like the bowl shapes the water, the listening will shape the telling of the story. So they always talked about, first, how do you create the listening? How do you make space for listening before people can tell their stories? And so that was one of the ways that this idea of listening really came through to me. But then, thinking about, democracy and human rights and so on, democracy is all about people having a voice, right? Everyone having a voice. So I think as much as we all want to speak to people and tell them that they need to think the way we do, no one wants to be told that they're wrong and they need to think the way you do. People want to be listened to. And so, I don't think you can expect anyone to change their views without feeling listened to, right? And I think there must at least, be the possibility in that interaction of also being changed ourselves, right? If we're going to listen to people, there must be the possibility that listening might change us in some way. And even if what we listen to is horrifying, and that's not, we'll never agree with that person. I think that we must be open to the possibility that we could be surprised, that we could listen to something and understand something that opens our eyes, right? And, in our work at Open Society Foundation, which was always about health, this was really crucial, right? So it was working with people who have HIV or people who use drugs and so on. And, the medical system, health system would say things like, well, people don't come for treatment, or people are lost to treatment, or these are difficult patients. Until you listen to people and understand what they're dealing with, and you figure out, well, they don't come to the clinic because they can't get there. They don't have the transport, or it's the wrong time of day and they can't skip work because they've got fired, whatever it is. Or, they walk into the door and everyone's watching and know that's the door that all the people with AIDS go through. So they're never going to go there because that's going to stigmatize them. Unless you listen and hear people's stories, you don't understand what's going on. And so, I think it's asking, why do people believe the things they do? And then what does that mean for how we might need to change what we're offering them? And so I think all of those experiences really brought home to me the crucial importance of listening.
How do we know the difference between when we're listening to learn or listening to respond?
I think we all know that in our, even though we might not admit it, we all know how we're thinking and how, what's going on in our heads. And I think we all know when we encounter it as well. There's just a sense of experience. You can feel the connection or not, it's there or it's not there. So I think it's learning to recognize that and kind of stepping back and saying, okay, what's happening, or what am I doing? How can I, refocus and change the way I'm listening here?
I think of what you just said recently, that willingness to be changed it's the lever for me. Like when I can listen with a willingness to be changed, then I take more away from what I'm hearing. Whether I apply it or not is another issue. But if I'm not willing to be changed, then I'm just kind of like being at the movies. You're just receiving pictures or images and a story of some sort. So as you've been doing your work, are you finding people willing to be changed, or is that taking more or less effort than it used to? I'm just curious, like what is happening societally?
I think probably it does take more effort, because it's, with just the way the media works and so on, it's so easy to move on, to switch off, to, try something else. We each, have the algorithms that feed us things that we expect to see, feed us things that we already know, the kind of algorithm already knows that we like. So it's more and more difficult to, I think, have that surprise and encounter things that we're not expecting and not used to. And I think often we have to try and find ways to get that, even like in small things, buying a book, right? If you go on Amazon and then you'll buy a book and it tells you, people like who bought this book also bought these other books. Very different from wandering through a bookstore and just suddenly stumbling about something you never knew existed, and suddenly picking it up and being surprised by it. So those opportunities are much more few and far between. So I think that is the thing that we have to think about, and how we get around that. And then I think because of the living online, there's just less consequences for just cutting things off and people off, because it doesn't matter. We just move on to the next thing. Whereas if you're in a community and with people you're accountable to in some way or other, that's not easy. I have like we live in a small town here in the Catskills, and you're going to see everyone at some point on the main street or in the supermarket and so on. So, that kind of creates a different kind of sense of, kind of accountability, I think, versus being very anonymous and online and not even knowing who the person's real name is that you're talking to.
Yeah, you can't be that jerk who then, drive in your car and then show up in the grocery store and have people go, "What was up with you, Brett? That was just way out of line." Because you get called on it in a small area when people know you. Yeah. And, or in a family, it's a similar thing. It's like, what's going on here? So I think that's interesting about your view from like how it can be harder with the algorithms and stuff also, because that just reinforces where we are, helps us stay planted where we are. And I know for me, when I'm in groups that I am like the odd man out, if you will, I'm the least like the group. Not always, but in those instances, it's always I have to make a conscious decision. Am I going to engage or observe? Engage or observe? And if I'm going to engage, to what degree? How much do I care about this? Like if I just got if I have a light caring or I'm not that invested, I might chip in a little. But honestly, if it's a tough thing, I'm going to be all in or nothing. But I also recognize that because of how things are shaped and like the people glomming onto people like them, the likelihood of my success is much diminished. But I don't stop, right? It's still going to happen.
I mean, look, there's the other side to it too, which is online. You can find people like you that you would never be able to find before, right? Which is the other side. So people in small towns who might feel oppressed by where they live and there's no one like them and have to flee now, at least you could find someone online. So it's not like I'm saying it's all bad, but I think it's just created a different way for how we interact.
Well, I think we have to be intentional. If we want to find new people, we have to reach out. We can't just wait for them to come rolling in. Personally, when I get like, you've read this book, here's your reading list, and I'm looking at it, I'm going, I don't want to read. I'm not interested. Right. This was a one-off book. I really liked it, though. So it's just interesting, the assumptions based on pattern that people make about you. And so how easy is it for us to do that about other people without even knowing it, to make those assumptions? Yeah. So what is on tap for you? I mean, we're coming into the end of 2024. So what's on tap, or what are you planning for 2025, Brett, in your work? Because you kind of are doing transformational work at a community level and person level.
So one of the things one of the organizations I work with is called IRIS, which is the International Resource for Impact and Storytelling. And with them, I organized a big international gathering in Colombia last year, and we're planning another one for next year in Ireland this time, but really bringing together people internationally who are working in this field of narrative and storytelling and social justice. But what I really enjoy doing is actually bringing people together from different backgrounds. So, in this case, it's activists, it's funders, it's academics and researchers. And then the power of bringing people together and kind of seeing what happens and creating a space where people can connect with other people that they won't never have a chance to connect with before. And that is always, I've done that several times in different ways, but that's always exciting to see when you bring different kinds of people together in an intentional way and seeing the connections people make and then the collaborations and ideas that happen as a result. So that's always great. I'm planning that. And I'm really looking to work more in this field of listening and trying to figure out what that means and how that looks like. But one of the things I'm hoping to do is really spend more time in putting all of this stuff together that I've written over the years into a book and try and get that out into the world. So that's what I'm looking to do. So I've said it now out loud, so I have to make it happen.
I like it. That's all doable. Iris, you can do. You've done it before, right? The conference. The concept of bringing those diverse groups together who kind of interact with the world at different places sounds fascinating. So I would imagine there are a lot of interesting things come out of that. But I'm very interested in your book as it comes along.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I hope it will. Yeah, so I have to get to work on that and make a plan to make it happen.
Just start, it'll happen.
Yeah.
You're that kind of guy. You'll get it done. So I want to leave you the opportunity to leave some last words for our listeners, things that you hope that we will think about as we go into this last quarter of 2024 and take with us.
Wow. Well, when you asked me about the future plans, I kind of hesitated because I've never been good at these kind of big long-term plans. And I've been thinking about this issue of strategy and story, and the fact that the world is changing so much and so quickly that the way we used to do strategy, I don't think is really that helpful anymore. By the time we've written a big strategy and taken 6 months, the world has changed. And so I think coming back to this idea of story, what is the story that we think we're in, and what does that look like? And using that story plus our sense of our identity and our values to then guide us. Because I think it's often going to be like figuring out the next few steps forward rather than being able to have a predetermined long-term strategy, because we're just going to have to be able to adapt very quickly and change. And so I think you have a clear story of who you are, what is your mission, your kind of ultimate goal that you're trying to achieve. What are your values? I think that all of those three things can help guide you then as you kind of take each next step in a very uncertain situation.
I couldn't agree with you more. if you have those things, when you step on the slippery rocks, you'll know where you're standing at any rate. Your foundation will be good. Yep. All right. I just had a vision when you did that of someone casting a fly, like fly fishing and casting their line and thinking, you just never know where it's going to end up.
Right.
But the intention was there.
Yeah.
So I wish you the best, Brett. And for folks listening, we have the links so you can reach out and connect to Brett, find out the work he's doing. He writes on Substack, he is on LinkedIn, and of course his business. And don't hesitate to reach out. He's a real guy. He's got smarts and he's wanting to help change the world.
You've been listening to the No Labels, No Limits podcast with best-selling author, change agent, and strategic business coach, Sarah Box. You can grab the show notes and find out how to work with Sarah at sarahbox.com/no labels, no limits podcast. We'd love this podcast to reach as many people as possible. Please remember to rate, leave a 5-star review, and share the podcast with someone you think would get value from this conversation. Till next time, keep taking those daily action steps to align your purpose to your principles and achieve your goals in business and life.